Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Lots to chat about today. I want to tackle some of the geopolitical military events going on all around the world. Man, it's busy right now. Trump wants to take Greenland, of course. What's going to happen next with Venezuela or Cuba? And, of course, Iran's situation there with the U.S. Will they strike Iran? Who knows? Okay, so we're going to try to sort some of this stuff out next. Before we do, a quick reminder to hit subscribe. Tell your friends about us as well. Our guest today, Dr. Christian Leuprecht. He is a military expert and a professor at both the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University. His website is christianleuprecht.com. And great to have you with us.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Nice to be back.
Oh, you bet. No, I'm looking forward to what you have to say because, I mean, you have a good idea of what's going on. The rest of us are kind of going, tilt, what is this all about, right? So why don't we start with U.S. President Trump's desire to acquire Greenland? This seems really, really important to him. I mean, for a while it sounded like he was actually going to use force. Now he's backed off of that, it seems. So that's probably a good thing. But he's determined. He says it's going to happen one way or another. Do you think that's the case? I mean, is this going to happen?
Well, we can all decode this together. I hopefully have might have some insights, and then we can see what we can put the pieces of the puzzle together. Look, I think the U.S. when it comes to Greenland or Venezuela has a 250-year tradition of looking out for its interests in the hemisphere. In particular, when it comes to its own security interests, and that's what we see the United States doing. The proposition with regards to interests is that the U.S. perceives a host of threats, and it believes that allies are not well and robustly prepared to countervail and fend off those threats. And so the U.S. is saying, look, we're just going to do it on our own. And allies can work with us and provide robust capabilities. And if allies don't do that, then we'll just have to look out for our own best interests in our backyard. And to some extent, look, I mean, we do bear some responsibility. Mm-hmm. Think, for instance, of anti-submarine warfare, right? These are capabilities we've let atrophy since the end of the Cold War. And now we have very aggressive moves by both Russia and China, both of whom have demonstrated, for instance, intent to cut critical infrastructure in terms of undersea cables. 95% of digital communications between North America and Europe run through cables that span from Greenland to Iceland to the United Kingdom. It's completely unacceptable to the United States that Russian submarines might get anywhere near to that and attempt to cut those cables. And so the United States is saying, look, I mean, same with hypersonic missiles that Russia now has, some of which it has used in the conflict in Ukraine. Countries can work with the United States to build capabilities the Trump administration perceives to be necessary to defend against those advanced weapons, or the United States will just do it on its own.
Yeah, I guess, with Trump, we have this love-hate relationship with him, right? and he's necessary to protect Canada. And you never know what he's going to do next, but it seems that when he says something, he might actually mean it, and he might follow through on it, as they learned in Venezuela. So in Greenland, I assume that he means what he says. How he's going to go about doing that, I'm not totally sure. I mean, now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe they have an agreement, I think it dates back to the 1950s with Greenland already, that the U.S. can, set up more military bases and so forth, put military personnel there. So, are they simply going to work with that, or are they going to say, no, we have to buy or acquire Greenland in some fashion?
Yeah, Trump's an unusual politician in that regard because he actually does what he says. Especially in this country, I think we've become mostly used to politicians saying things but not actually doing what they say. And so I think in that sense, he's taking much of the world somewhat by surprise. But we also shouldn't be surprised because there's a lot of continuity here from the first Trump administration. And so I think we see Trump simply following through on sort of his what he's looking to assert in terms of his particular vision of the world. I think there's also a sense of that the United States is beleaguered by adversaries and that the United States has lost the initiative, and that Trump is very much about retaking the initiative. And if nothing else, if you look at the pace at which Trump is moving, he's clearly showing that he has the initiative. When it comes to the Arctic, when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to Venezuela, that he's not just going to sit idly by and let adversarial states control the agenda. In Greenland, Greenland has always been key to defending the continent and defending the Arctic and control of the Arctic, right? So this is why you have this agreement going back to 1951. And under this agreement, of course, the U.S. has extensive latitude to do essentially what it feels it wants. In the 1950s, the U.S. stationed nuclear bombers, strategic nuclear bombers on Greenland, and didn't ask Copenhagen. So there's extensive.
So there's precedent here. This may very well happen then.
Decades of precedent, and so I think part of this is about. Some of this is about making sure that countries such as Denmark contribute to some of these very expensive ventures.
Right.
Some of this is you need Denmark's collaboration, for instance, in NORAD, if you're going to defend against hypersonic missiles and fighter jets. And Denmark has always been sort of a half member of NORAD, so it's a clear signal that. But of course, that also means Denmark is going to have to pony up in terms of fighter jets. In terms of anti-submarine warfare capabilities, Denmark's a small country, 5 million people, even more challenging than for Canada to provide these capabilities. And, the Danes for a long time, during the Cold War, they were very proud to be a strategically important country. And then they sort of lost that importance with the end of the world of the Cold War. And they needed to make themselves relevant, for instance, by participating in missions like Afghanistan. And now they're thrust back into relevance, I think, much more than they might like. And of course, the same is true for Canada.
Oh, isn't it?
Right? That's, we've got this, I think the 51st state sort of mantra by the United States is very much about there's a whole host of things we need Canada to do. First and foremost is make sure that Canada doesn't become a backdoor for transnational organized crime, for heinous Russian weapons, for Russian submarines. And look, sure, we can be smart Canadians, but the reality is, on a good day, we have one operational submarine in this country. Many days, we have none, because even that one submarine is often not deployable. So how are we going to assert our sovereignty when other countries can freely traverse our Arctic waters, surface and especially subsurface? So we have no capabilities even to detect them or to say no, this is Canadian territory. You can't run your submarine through here. And we need to understand where the United States is going to challenge Canadian sovereignty, if it really wants to challenge us, is not going to be at land. It's going to be in the Arctic, precisely because our capabilities, what we have, is so homeopathic.
Yeah, so we have this yap from Canadian politicians, Canadian sovereignty, but we have zero to back that up. We basically have to rely on the U.S. So Trump is right in that sense, and I know we don't like to hear that, but that's simply a matter of fact. Like it or not like it, it's just true. Well, let's shift gears here. We have a whole bunch of stuff to cover here. We probably won't get to all of it, but I wanted to touch on the Venezuelan situation here as well. And if you're just joining us, you can already tell our guest, Professor Leuprecht, he knows exactly what's going on around here. So we want to get that expert opinion. ChristianLeuprecht.com is the website there. But in Venezuela, lots of people upset with Trump, of course. Others celebrating the fact that a violent dictator has been removed in Maduro. And but at this point, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially we still have the same government in place, right? It's a leftist, Marxist government. Different president now, the vice president becoming president. So has anything changed on the ground for everyday people who are looking for freedom?
So let's build the segue from our previous conversation to this. So NORAD functional arrangement goes back to the 1950s precisely because we're a modest economy. We'd never be able to protect the North on our own. So we partnered with the United States in doing so. That also gives the United States leverage. And of course, there's probably no country in the world that is more integrated with the United States and more vulnerable to U.S. unilateralism than Canada. Think about our defense, our economy, our finances, our technology platforms, our energy, our electricity grids. Now, of course, with Venezuela, the U.S. has a bit less latitude. And so, especially that now that Venezuela had effectively become a client state of China, Russia, and Iran, and of course, it's not by accident, I think, that the United States went in 3 hours after Maduro met with a very high-level Chinese delegation. This was clearly about poking the stick in China's eyes. And it's also no accident that it turns out 32 Cuban intelligence and security officials happened to die in that particular raid. That was a very clear signal to everyone who was watching about there's a strong continuity, 250 years, 200 years of Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine was about we will not tolerate colonial powers meddling in America's backyard. And the 21st century version of that, the infamous Monroe Doctrine, is we will not tolerate hybrid warfare and failed states that are being essentially controlled by adversarial foreign forces. And so, but what's also interesting is, of course, that previously people were always concerned about, the Americans want to generate regime change.
Right.
And I think the Americans have learned that regime change often doesn't go well. It creates a lot of instability. Look at Libya, look at Iraq. You might say that, Iran was the first regime change, CIA regime change, Mossadegh, 1954, deposed by the CIA, and we live with the consequences ever since. And so, my argument has long been sort of like the Americans need a much lighter touch. And so that's what the president is doing. He's basically saying to the elites, look, we're not here to take you out. He could have taken out, for instance, the interior minister, who's effectively the guy who controls the intelligence service and who's been running and orchestrating much of the drug supply chain. But they didn't. Why? Because he's also responsible for the stability of the regime. And so this is sort of about, we need you to work with us. Stop working with the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians. You will now be working for us. Not with us, you'll be working for us.
Oh, wow.
And you can either, you can either play ball, or we're going to come in and we're going to get you as well. And
wow. So in your view here, there's enough pressure. These guys know what's going on, right? The people you mentioned who are in control of the Secret Service, et cetera, all the drugs, all that kind of stuff in Venezuela. These are leaders of the country. So they're keeping them there, but there's a message sent that they could be taken out. And do you think that's enough, I guess, pressure that they are going to say, yes, sir, we will work not even with you, but for you with the U.S.? Is that enough to do it, do you think?
Look, the single most important thing for any authoritarian regime is regime survival.
Okay.
Especially since Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. Because what did all the authoritarians learn? People like Putin, people like Xi, what did we get from those interventions? All the human rights activists, you got to go in, you got to get the dictators and change the regime. Well, what did Putin learn? Well, I got to stay in power forever. Because if I'm out of power, my head might roll.
Right.
Like Gaddafi and like Saddam Hussein. So this is why these authoritarian regimes have become so difficult to dislodge in the 21st century. And so Trump's sending the message that, like, look, I'm not here to judge anybody. I'm not here to make people's heads roll as long as you do America's bidding.
Wow.
And in some cases, that might even be acceptable to China and to Russia. Look, China and Russia were surprisingly quiet about the U.S. raid on Venezuela.
I was somewhat surprised not to hear more. Yeah.
Well, if you're Putin and you're trying to hedge your bets, where are you going to put your chips? You're going to put your chips on Ukraine, not on Venezuela. And, if you're trying to get a trade deal and you're Xi Jinping in China, you're trying to hedge your bets about, are you going to go in on Venezuela, which really provides a relatively small proportion of your oil to begin with, and compromise the ability to get a deal with the Trump administration? Or are you just going to let it go and just kind of say, we don't like what's happening here? And look, the Trump administration, there's a domino effect here, right? It's now negotiating with Cuba, apparently, trying to get a deal, right? So, the same premise that now that Cuba isn't getting any oil anymore from Venezuela, the regime is basically done. And I think the Trump administration is telling the regime, look, you want to work with us. And none of this should come as a surprise, because the three leading figures in the Trump administration on foreign policy don't come out of the traditional foreign policy establishment from the Beltway, from Boston, New York to Washington. They come from Florida. They know South America. They know that neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I think, this is what I mean when I say Trump is taking the initiative. He's not letting adversaries run the world anymore. And we see the same thing with Iran.
Well, let me ask you quick, just briefly, do you think there is going to be a democratic, honest election sometime in the next couple of years in Venezuela, or no?
I think the administration is probably preparing the way for that. Now, how free and fair that election might be, we will need to say. But the interesting thing about Venezuela is, of course, there is an opposition. And so the U.S. could effectively try to force a reasonably fair and democratic election and try to generate regime change by those means. And in the meantime, the kleptocratic elites will take their money, leave the country, and hunker down in some third country. That option is not available in Iran because there is no organized opposition in Iran. And now without the internet, you definitely can't organize. So everybody in Iran knows what they're against, but nobody knows what they're for. And so the Trump administration understands that and is sending a message to the regime about look, we're not here to change the regime. We just have 3 expectations. No nuclear weapons, stop the missile program, and stop funding your militias throughout the region. Now, all of which is unacceptable to Iran, but all of which might be acceptable to both Russia and China, none of whom have said much about Iran. And so, I think this is classic 19th century gunboat diplomacy. We show up with the Armada and you can either negotiate or it's going to get really painful really fast.
Yeah, well, the Armada is there. That's a powder keg. Iran says they're willing to talk, sort of, as long as you don't threaten us. But, it's all unfolding in front of our eyes. Everybody can see what's happening. But, look what happened last time, right? Do you think Iran will acquiesce and bow to the U.S. pressure? Or, will there have to be, again, as Trump said, well, I guess we're going to find out, if Iran is actually going to go to war with us or not. And if they don't, come to some sort of non-nuclear, I guess, agreement here. So do you think there's going to be some sort of strikes happening?
Well, the Middle East is all about saving face. If you are embarrassed in the Middle East, if you look weak, that is a personal insult. So cornering the Iranians is not going to be a strategy. So in Venezuela, you can do that. I think you can corner the regime. The elites are just kleptocratic power brokers, like in Russia, and they'll take whatever they can. In Iran, the regime, I think, is not going to back down if it looks like it's being bullied by the United States. It will take whatever punishment it needs. And the regime, the state institution of the state, as we can see, are quite strong. Here's a country that killed thousands of its own citizens. And there seems to be, it doesn't seem to be a real challenge to the institutions. So, I think it's going to be much harder. But we also have to remember that the Iranians really, it's hard for the Iranians to negotiate with the United States because the United States, they consider the United States sort of an upstart, right? The Iranians are a 6,000-year-old civilization. They see themselves as such. They see the Americans as like people, just showed up yesterday and they're going to go away as quickly as they showed up. And so for the Iranians, this is sort of biding their time and waiting it out in the broader sort of arc of history. So I think that's their approach to negotiating, and sort of you just kind of try to buy time, and so we'll see. So I think they come with very different, as they often say in the Middle East, the Americans might have the watch, but we have the time.
Oh, that's interesting. Wow. Okay. I just talked to an Iranian pastor actually recently who he's involved with hundreds of underground churches in Iran. He's saying he heard that the Ayatollah, like Khomeini's son, moved $1 billion out of the country here this just recently. So, those kinds of things happening, is it possible that they're seeing that their time's up? And, maybe there's even something internally, there's going to be a battle for power, of course. Is there a shifting change happening? Are they going to fall, you think, within the next year?
So what's the alternative to the mullahs?
That's a good question.
The alternative is effectively a military dictatorship. And if we think we have a problem today with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards building weapons or attempting to build weapons we'd rather not have them build, we're like, having a military dictatorship isn't going to solve that. It's actually going to make it worse. Because there's not going to be then a counter in terms of the mullahs and in terms of the democratically elected government. There'll just be a bunch of generals who will run the country in their interest. And of course, many of the younger officers have seen the corruption and the exceptional wealth of the senior civilian and military leadership in Iran. And their sense is, now it's our turn. This is why they're sticking by the regime. The kleptocrats are lining up. In Iran, of course, this is why these countries are so tragic. Russia, Iran, Venezuela, right? These are countries that should be jewels of the world. In terms of their prosperity, what they could provide for their people with their natural resource wealth. And, if they didn't leverage for basically idiosyncratic ideological purposes and basically to enrich a small kleptocratic elite. So, so I think it's taking out the mullahs is not necessarily a great alternative if you think about what comes after. And so I think this is why the Trump administration is, but, clearly the mullahs must be realizing, look, I mean, since 2009, we've had a cascading row of protests in the street in Iran. The mullahs must be realizing that the end is nigh, the writing is on the wall. And look, who's going to support a government that effectively has completely impoverished the country, can't govern? I mean, these people can't keep the lights on or the water running in Tehran, like basic things, that, at least the Chinese regime has figured out. You need a robust economy and you need to provide for the people. Even Putin has understood that, right? Like the regime doesn't know how to do the very basics. Look at the environmental degradation in Iran. I mean, it is horrifying, right? So, like, if you have to live this every day as an Iranian citizen, you can see even if, you would not have any hope that these people could actually do any better. But the problem in Iran is also, I mean, Venezuela is it's a problem. But you might be able to fix Venezuela. The problem in Iran is, of course, the Iranian Revolution has always understood itself as an alternative for nation building, that you can build an Islamic-inspired state, a Shia-inspired state, that 1979 model. And so the problem for the mullahs is it is also giving up on their experiment to show that effectively that experiment has failed. And this idea of an Islamic revolution has fundamentally failed and is not an option for building a modern state. And when you've invested decades in that belief that you're building a better future for your people, and now you're confronted with the fact that really you've been deluding yourself and you've been completely sort of misgoverning the country and your people hate you for it, that's a very tough realization when you're 86 years old.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. It'll be interesting once he dies. Will that trigger some sort of a shift there? Wanted to briefly touch on China here as well. Before the time gets away on us here, you mentioned China. Xi Jinping making some key military changes there. Several of his top generals taken away from power. So what does that mean? So does this mean he's got total control over China? I know I've heard that there's some internal dissent going on. There's a battle there. Is that going to continue? Or are we going to see more changes?
China is a very complex country, and we understand, Western intelligence services understand surprisingly little, especially about the inner elite dynamics. So we can sort of speculate a bit based on what we know. So there's two separate accounts. One account is that the individual was removed. The other is that that individual was effectively trying to stage a quasi-coup and trying to take out Xi Jinping. What exactly happened? We know that there was an exchange of gunfire at a hotel. We know that there's about 24 people who died. And we know Xi Jinping was present. Or I should say there's some debate about whether Xi Jinping was present or somebody forewarned him. So the one question is this different power brokers sort of colluding against each other? And so Xi Jinping sort of taking out, interesting enough, much of the old guard, right? So Xi Jinping, the general who was taken out, these are all part of what are known as the Red Princelings. So these are kids of effectively the revolutionary sort of cadre that then sort of make their claim to being to running China. And so Xi Jinping being one of those, but he's basically taken out much of sort of his the other princelings that have staked a claim, especially at the very senior level. The other is that this general, I mean, so he's very different than the one general who's left and that the generals who are there now. This is somebody who dates back to the War of Vietnam. He's one of the very few people left who've actually fought a war and had to contest a war. And so there was some sense that this is a general who was speaking truth to power, who was telling Xi Jinping that his military is not ready to contest a war with the United States over Taiwan, which of course is what Xi Jinping has been telling us for years. Yes. That by 2027, we're going to be ready to take Taiwan.
I've only got 30 seconds left. I got to leave it there. But so this is maybe making it less likely for an attack on Taiwan.
That's generally the interpretation, that so much of the senior leadership is now in such disarray, and the People's Liberation Army is likely much less prepared.
I need to have you on again. There's so many more questions I want to ask you here, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. This is great. So ChristianLeuprecht.com is the website. Thanks for watching. WizeUp.ca.